We are live, we're recording, we got everything set. Hello, Susan Meissner. Hello, Hazel Gaynor. It's a Saturday morning here in California. Hazel, what time is it? You are in Ireland, is that correct?
I am. I'm in County Kildare. Hello, everybody watching. It is 6 o'clock in the evening. I had to check. I've been everywhere. I've just got back from a tour in England, so I'm not sure what day it is. But it's I think 6 o'clock on Saturday evening here in Ireland.
All right. And Susan, who used to be down here in San Diego with us, but I think we're still in the same time zone. Where are you?
We are. Yes.
You are.
We're in the Pacific Northwest now. Mm-hmm.
I love what you said earlier. You went from one border to the other. So you went from San Diego all the way. I think you said in the green room you could actually see Canada's like right there.
It's right there. Yeah, we're pretty far north. Yep, but it's wonderful, beautiful. We're in a great location. Couldn't be happier.
I love it. All right. Well, we're going to give Facebook a minute or two to just get everybody on board with us here. So if you're watching this on YouTube later, sorry that we're not live for you, but stay with us. It's going to be a great conversation. But those of you that are live with us on Facebook and are joining us from who knows where around the world, that's why we were talking in the green room. I still love doing these because we get to just, like we were saying, Hazel and Susan, getting you two together in the same room would be a challenge these days, I think. So glad that you're here with us. And Hazel, this time you were the interviewer last time with Julia, and now you're the interviewee. So
yeah, I'm not quite sure which is harder sometimes. It's not easy to host a chat. So yeah, flipped roles this time.
Flipped roles. Well, we're so glad to have you back with your new book, The Last Lifeboat. So
thank you.
So for those of you that are on Facebook with us right now, there's probably lots of people that have heard this before, but for those that maybe haven't, in the comment section or chat section of Facebook is where I'm going to put Hazel's new book, The Last Lifeboat, and I'll also put Susan's new book, Only the Beautiful, will go in there as well. Warwick's can ship those books to you in the US, not quite international yet, but I'm sure there's a good bookstore wherever you're at if you're internationally watching with us. But if you're in San Diego, Warwick's is located just a little bit north of San Diego. We'd love for you to come into the store and pick those books up, or shop for other things, but we always can ship those to you. Also in that comment section is where you're going to put questions. Susan and Hazel are going to talk for about 35-ish minutes, maybe a little bit more, and then we'll bring your questions. We always love the audience questions, so be thinking of some good ones for us. And we'd also love to know where you're calling in from. So on the comment section, go ahead and put where you're watching us from today. So with that, I'm going to do my official job of introducing these two lovely authors, and then I'll go away for a little bit. So Hazel Gaynor is an award-winning New York Times, USA Today, Irish Times, and international best-selling author. Her last historical novel, set in China during World War II, published in the UK, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand as The Bird in the Bamboo Cage, and in the US and Canada as When We Were Young and Brave. I always love that. Well, that might be a good conversation thing. that change of title is always an interesting. It was an Irish Times bestseller, a national bestseller in the USA, and was shortlisted for the 2020 Irish Book Awards. She's here today to talk about her latest, like I've said, The Last Lifeboat. Joining Hazel is Susan Meissner. Susan is a former managing editor of a weekly newspaper and an award-winning columnist. She is the award-winning and New York Times bestselling author of Only the Beautiful, The Nature of Fragile Things, A Fall of Marigolds, among several other novels. Susan and Warwick, we go back a long way, so we're so glad that you're here with us. So both of you have a great conversation, and we'll see you in a little bit.
Great.
Thank you, Julie.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And Hazel, it is so good to see you again. We're not in the same room like we were last time, but it is really wonderful to connect this way over the internet and talk about your new book, which I absolutely loved. So I'm really glad. We have some great questions for you. And if you don't mind, I thought we'd go right to it. The one thing I did want to ask before we get to my very first question is, I'm glad you told us where in Ireland you are located, because I've always wondered, and I've also wanted to know what it has been like, and you can be really short and brief on this, what it has been like to become an Irish citizen. I know you were born in England, correct? And you've become an Irish citizen. What has that been like?
Oh, do you know what? It was really special. So I moved to Ireland 22 years ago. My husband's Irish. I moved for love. And I got my citizenship actually just through the pandemic. And when my passport arrived, and there was a lovely ceremony online with around 1,000 other new Irish citizens, and we all pledged our allegiance, and it was absolutely magical. I'm not quite sure what I expected, but I was very emotional. I'm very proud to now have my dual nationality and have my Irish passport. So yeah, it just felt like it completed my journey here. So very special, yeah.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. Great. Well, everybody, this is Hazel's new book, and it is truly masterful. I was riveted from page one. I got to read an early copy. I'm really glad I did. And because I got to read it early, I had forgotten all the different things you had mentioned in your author's note, and I reread them this morning. And again, I was just chilled to the bone by the premise of this book because it's based on fact. So if maybe for our first question, if you could just tell people what this book is about in general terms, and then I want to hear more about what it's really about. So if you want to just go ahead and bring us into the world of The Last Lifeboat.
Absolutely. Yeah, The Last Lifeboat was inspired by true story, true events that took place quite close to the beginning of World War II, so summer of 1940. And I was reading an article on the Imperial War Museum website, and I saw one phrase I'd never come across before, and that was the word sea evacuees. Now, I was very familiar with the mass evacuation that had taken place at the start of the war to take children out of the dangers of bombs from cities to the countryside in England. But I hadn't ever heard of children being evacuated overseas, so to Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And isn't it such an amazing thing when you find a piece of hidden history in an event you think you know everything about, you think you've read everything about. So my alerts immediately went off, and I read more, and I went on to read that one of these sea evacuee ships sailing from Liverpool to Canada was hit by a torpedo from a U-boat in the middle of the Atlantic, which on its own would be a shocking and tragic enough event, knowing that there are children on board. But this remarkable thing happened, that in the rescue effort, one lifeboat with survivors was missed in the rescue operation. Gone down with the ship. Families were informed of that, yet there was a lifeboat of survivors missing in the Atlantic for 8 days. And that lifeboat's story is really encapsulated in The Last Lifeboat. I fictionalized the ship that's torpedoed. I fictionalized the characters, but it's very much based on true story of the city of Benares, that ship and its lifeboat. And it was just a real goosebumps moment. I felt so many emotions straight away, and there were so many questions. I had so many questions about how and why and what, and just immediate jumping off point for a fictional, I suppose, look at that event. Yeah, just astonishing.
Yeah, I think as a mother, you and I are both moms. It really it's a you get captivated by the way you tell the story, and even though you want everything to turn out well, you know that before you can even hope for things to turn out well, things are going to be really difficult. And just the the way it happened was particularly troubling to me, and that is, the U-boat, it followed that ship, and it almost waited for it to be alone. And the fact that it was in a convoy, it had an escort, and then the escort left, and thinking that they were in safe waters, thinking that, we're not in the area where U-boats are anymore, so we're good to go. So there they are, alone and exposed, and 10 o'clock at night, all of that. And do you know, based on your research, was the commander of that U-boat aware that it was a boat of, there were 90 children aboard, and maybe there were other people too, but were they aware of what they were targeting, or do they not know? They just see a radar blip on a screen and they just bomb whatever it is. Do you know if they knew what they were targeting?
Yeah, interestingly, there is a lot of information about this event, and I think that's what's remarkable as a historical novelist. we get to see obviously the aftermath of these events and the, I suppose, the legacy of who was that commander of that U-boat and why did he fire a torpedo at a ship carrying children? Short answer, he did not know that there were children on board. And that's one of the sort of repercussions of this event was, why was this ship and any of the CVAC ships, why were they not given special protection? Why were some sort of instructions not sent out so that they weren't attacked? This was a program that was established when Churchill was Prime Minister in Britain, and he really didn't want this evacuation program to go ahead. He felt that evacuating children from Britain sent the wrong message to the enemy. It was like, we may as well surrender now. But it went ahead nevertheless, and parents were given a choice really, to apply to have their child put onto one of these ships or to keep them at home with the threat of invasion. At the time, the Nazis were in France, so it was very, very close proximity to invading England next. And bombs were expected. So just the most, as you say, as a mother, the most agonizing, impossible choice. And these ships, as you say, they were escorted by naval warships in a convoy to a point in the Atlantic Ocean where it was believed U-boats weren't active. But obviously at a time of war, things can change very quickly, mistakes are made, and the ship carrying these evacuees was left by its naval escort, believing that it was in safe, I mean, really is anywhere safe at a time of war, safe waters. Right. And this U-boat, it was the third torpedo that was fired at the city of Benares that struck. The first two missed because the conditions at sea that night were quite rough. So it's even more tragic that that third torpedo actually hit. And obviously in the sort of review and looking at things after, there were questions about why had the naval escort left? Why did none of the other ships in the convoy return to help, to rescue survivors? But no, that U-boat commander didn't know that there were children on board. Neither did the Lord Admiral of the British Navy, which is a whole other question.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, how would you describe these two main characters? Their names are Alice and Lily. And what I wonder most about is like, what part of their backstory, whether we hear about it or not, what part of their backstory informs their actions and reactions and prepares them for this experience?
Yeah, so the last lifeboat is told through my two main characters, Alice and Lily. Alice is one of the people who volunteered to escort these evacuees on this long journey because their parents weren't with them. And she is based on a real person called Mary Cornish, who was a music teacher in London, who stepped up to volunteer to do her bit during the war and found herself the only woman in that lost lifeboat. And as the only woman, really defaulted to the carer of the children that were in the lifeboat. So my character Alice is very much shaped by Mary Cornish's real story. And then the contrasting side of this event is told by Lily, who's an entirely fictional character. And she's a mother in London being, sort of bombarded by the Blitz, who has decided to apply to have her children evacuated. And it really felt important to me to show this one event from two very different points of view. So we get the drama of the lifeboat and we see what's happening there. And then the agony and the questions and the distance of this mother, Lily, in London. They're both very different women, but very strong women. And that seems to be a theme that runs through. If anyone listening has read any of my books, they'll know strong women really dominate on the page. And as a woman who's grown up surrounded by strong Yorkshire women in particular, there's no surprise that that's happened. But they both have their own backstory of hurt, pain, and questioning their place a little bit in the world. And I think, as a lot of people did when war broke out, what do you do? How do you become useful? How do things change? How do your circumstances drastically change? And actually very, very similar to how we, I think, experienced life in the pandemic. Everything that's familiar is suddenly very unfamiliar. and very much so the women whose lives I've based these two characters on. So Alice very much wants to do something to help, has always found herself a little bit lacking, and here's an opportunity for her to step up. And with Lily, I won't tell you too much about her backstory, but, you know, as a mother facing this choice, I think we can all, you know, relate to the agony of that. They meet once very briefly, but it's almost how this one event can really just connect people's lives in the most tragic, but also hopeful and beautiful ways. You know, with tragedy often comes, doesn't it, hope and goodness, kindness. And there's a lot of that threaded through the last lifeboat as well.
Right. So I've done the same thing with books of mine where I have an event that I want to write about, and then I bring fictional characters into the story. Yeah. And for that reason, sometimes the themes are already there and you just bring them to light. And sometimes as you're writing, the themes kind of, they appear to you. So do you feel like the themes in your book were there already and you knew what they were and you began to write about them? Or do you feel like it was as you were writing that these themes appeared to you? They seemed to kind of like rise to the surface. And what are they?
Yeah, great question. And you know, and you do this so beautifully yourself, Susan. You know, and anyone listening who's read any of your books will know as well. You do such a beautiful job of really, you're sort of bringing emotion out of ordinary, you know, women in extraordinary circumstances, and how do we pull on those resources we don't know we have. For me, I think the themes to an extent were already there. The framework of war comes with its own set of themes, doesn't it? Because we know we're at a time of flux, at a time of danger, but also at a time of choice. And I think that really came out for me, the consequence of choice, and which side do we land on? You know, do we step up and volunteer and do our bit, or do we do what some people did and, you know, object to the whole issue of war, you know, morally have a really, you know, strong response to that? Do we, as a parent, take the choice to send our children to safety, or do we want to keep them with us? We believe they're safer with us. How do we then therefore cope with that change in our circumstances? What is it like to be left without your children? So yeah, I think the themes of fear, uncertainty, as I've said, hope. I've written about tragedy so often, and they just go hand in hand. You know, tragedy and hope, that as we always see when, unfortunately, we seem to have lived through some extraordinarily harrowing events, don't we? From 9/11 through to the pandemic and many, many things. And wherever we see tragedy, we always see people helping. And I always have said to my children, you know, to try and understand what's happening, look to the people who are helping. There are always good people. But certainly that seems to have really stood out for me as I wrote this book. You know, Alice makes choices, Lily makes choices. There are male characters in the book who make quite different choices about war to what we may expect. And I think it rings true with that. When we read historical fiction, I think we're partly thinking, what would I have done? Would I have volunteered? Would I have made that choice? And it's that what if and the consequence of choice that I feel came out as I wrote the book.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love how you dovetailed tragedy and hope like that. That's terrific. Thank you for bringing that to light like that. So, I know you fictionalized this last lifeboat, but those 8 days felt very, very real to me as the reader. So was there a memoir, or how did you recreate those very difficult days? How did you make it seem like you were there on the boat with them? How did you approach that research-wise?
Yeah, and I've had a lot of response from readers about the raw emotion and the sense of being in the water, and really visceral sort of emotions of the danger, the sounds, the smell, the the cramped conditions. And it's quite shocking because I am terrified of the sea. I'm not really a very strong swimmer. I'm terribly seasick. If I even look at something going up and down like a wave, I feel nauseous. So maybe there's actually quite a lot of my own fear of the open ocean that has come out in writing this book. But I was very fortunate to have incredibly detailed accounts from survivors, both adults and children. There are some incredible books written by some of the people who were there, and then other journalistic kind of studies of this Lifeboat 12 and the city of Benares, the ship that sailed. So astonishing detail about what people ate, you know, what were in the survival stores that were packed onto each lifeboat, you know, really difficult scenes, even people desperately hungry. They were given little portions every day of tinned fruit, tinned salmon, but often couldn't even swallow the food because their mouths were so dry because they were dehydrated and water supplies were so limited. Just the desperation of a sweetness from a pineapple, slice of pineapple, and things we just take for granted everything became a little microcosm, I think, of life in that lifeboat. You know, days and nights pass, there's eternal hope that the next thing they'll see will be rescue. And I think it's just that terror of being lost amid this vast, unyielding ocean and nothing changes. And it was just really visceral to read those descriptions. And I think I used that and then allowed my imagination to field in any gaps and sort of throw my own terror into there. But it was quite tense and intense to write those scenes in the lifeboat. Yeah.
No wonder. Wow. This might be a little heady question. So if you need to think about it, we'll come back to it. But does the lifeboat have like a metaphorical role? Like, what does it represent to the story? And what does it represent to you personally? And if we need to come back to it, we can.
No, it's really interesting you've asked about the lifeboat, because I didn't intend to create really any emotional connection between my character and lifeboat. And you'd think that this was the worst possible place to have ever been in your life, and that therefore you would be very happy to never see it again and never think about it again. And as I wrote the book, I found myself becoming quite emotional about the lifeboat itself, and it almost became a character in itself. And there's a few scenes where that's alluded to by the people in the lifeboat, and that it itself, in this terribly perilous situation, becomes the only safe haven. And it is home. It's home. It's the one thing keeping them safe. And there's an amazing quote, I can't remember where I read it, but it's something about a lifeboat really should never serve its purpose. We hope a lifeboat never does what it's intended to do, because then we're in a horrible situation. And that it does take on its own character when it's needed. And when readers read a particular scene, I hope they'll remember this conversation. And there's a particular scene where this plays out. And so I'm really pleased you asked that, because it really did become surprisingly metaphorical, but also its own character in the book. Yeah.
I love that. I'm so glad I asked that question, and I'm so glad you've already thought about it, because I love your answer. I really, really do.
Thank you.
Did this novel change you in any way? Like, did it broaden your perspective, or did you learn something new about yourself in the writing?
Well, I think, I think it's hard not to, first of all, you learn a piece of history, and I think you're very much the same, but each book you write is a different piece of history, perhaps a slightly different era. And there's something fascinating about that, and really deep diving into that event, those people, those lives. You inhabit it, don't you, for a very long period of time. So I think it's hard not to be affected by that. For me, certainly, I think I connected with this story particularly because I'm a mother. And you do think that perhaps people in the past were somehow better prepared to face these circumstances, but of course they weren't, no more than we would be now. And to sort of imagine yourself in that situation, you really do have to sort of emotionally go there. I think every book changes me a little as a writer. I think it's impossible not to have that happen. And this was a very different writing experience. So the book that Julie mentioned in the intro, my previous book, When We Were Young and Brave, was also set in World War II, but told over 5 years. The Last Lifeboat is effectively told over 8 days with a little bit of framework around it. So a very different writing experience, and a challenge actually for me to sustain that drama in a lifeboat where really nothing much changes.
Right.
Yeah. So yes, definitely I have learned a lot about a piece of the war I didn't know. And I learned a lot about my abilities as a writer, I think, as well. Yeah, it really challenged me. And I like to challenge myself. I like to keep things interesting.
I hadn't thought about that before, that every day was pretty much the same for them in that boat. And to be able to, like you say, sustain the tension, you did a great job with that. So, well
Thank
done.
you.
So what was your favorite scene to write? And tell us about it without spoiling anything, or maybe you can tell us about it in general terms. What was your favorite part to write?
Oh, that's difficult. I think it's hard not to become very attached to your opening scene, because that's where the book literally begins. And it's funny, I was looking at very early notes I had written. I write on a keyboard, on a desktop computer. I use Microsoft Word, very straightforward. But my very first notes about this book, when I was looking at that article about sea evacuees, I handwrote in a notebook, and I found it. I actually shared it as a tweet on publication day, a little snippet of a paragraph, which is very, very close to the finished opening scene. The character was called Annie initially, she changed to Alice, but it's very similar description of this opening drama of some woman finding herself leaving a sinking ship. She's in a lifeboat. It's wild and stormy. She's panicked. She doesn't know what to do. And yet she's asked to look after some children who are also in the lifeboat. And she almost doesn't want the responsibility. So terrified. And I wrote that scene, handwritten in a notebook, and it's very, very close to what we've ended up with. And I think you go through so many iterations in redrafting and editing. Those early chapters I go back to again and again and again whilst I'm drafting. So I could almost read them off in my head at times. So I think it's hard to not naturally have them as a favorite, because I think you probably work on them, you touch them more often.
Sure.
But I suppose every part of the book has to be there. And there's a very, very moving scene towards the end, which was very difficult to write, but very touching to write. So yeah, the book ends, I suppose.
Yes, yes. So one thing you feature in your book, which I had not heard of before, were these excerpts from mass observations. So can you tell us what that is and where you found those and what they represent?
Yeah, and again, another lovely piece of hidden history. So during the war, the Ministry of Information, which sounds like something out of Harry Potter, one of the British war departments, was tasked with appointing 500 very ordinary people from across all walks of life in Britain, keep a diary, whatever they wanted that to be. So a few lines a day, 10 pages a day, whatever they interpreted that to mean. And they kept this diary, I think, almost a couple of years before war broke out. I think war was anticipated. And all the way through, I think the last entries were submitted early 1960s, and it was called mass observation. And it was really a way for the government to do a litmus test of the mood of the country. So it's really a modern day Twitter, Instagram, blog. And I found a book called Blitz Spirit by a fabulous archivist called Becky Brown, where she has found the archive. It's kept at the University of Sussex, I think. And these absolutely incredible first person, very honest accounts of war. And they're hilarious because they say things like, oh, it's just really annoying not to be able to have butter, because of rationing. And, it was so, it's so unpleasant because I can't see my friends anymore because they're in Scotland and it's not safe to go to Scotland, and just very mundane responses to this event. We often put big bookmarks and milestones around, but just day-to-day interruptions. And I thought that was a lovely way of just having little insights into war throughout the last lifeboat. So I created my own fictional diarists. So the entries in the last lifeboat that sort of pepper in every now and again are my imagined mass observation diarists, just catching a little mood of the war, partly to relieve the tension within the book, sort of get a breath, take a beat between some of the drama and emotion unfolding. And I really enjoyed writing them. Yeah, it was great fun.
That is so smart of you to make them up, because I was just going to ask you, how did you find them? If there's 500 diarists and they wrote for 6 years, how did you find these little nuggets? That was very smart of you. Just imagine them, because you could imagine them and be fairly spot on because of the research you had done. That's brilliant. And how insightful for this Ministry of Information to think of that. I feel like that's very forward thinking. It
really is, isn't it? That there was this sort of an understanding that this incredibly seismic event was going to take place, and that it would be important to catch the mood of the country. And I also think, to give people an opportunity to express some of their emotions. So it wasn't all sort of pent up anger and frustration. You can imagine people, dear diary, I'm furious, the government has done this, that, and the other. So I think it was quite clever and very modern, very forward thinking. Yeah,
very much.
Fascinating.
Very much so, because if they hadn't done that, what we would know is, well, this is what happened. But the diarists tell us, well, this is what it was like,
Absolutely.
I'm just in awe of that. I'm going to have to look into that and
it's amazing. An absolute gold dust for a historical novelist, because that's what you want. You want the primary source, first person, who had no agenda. This wasn't propaganda.
Right.
It was just their reflections of life. And sometimes it's quite dull and boring. And isn't that, real? That's real.
Yes.
It wasn't all drama all the time. Yeah, fascinating.
Right. That's awesome. All right, so I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to see if we have any questions from the audience. And if they don't have any quite yet, then I have a couple of more, but this will give them a chance to think about what they might want to ask.
You've been warned.
Let's see. I'm going to see which one I want to ask you. So you were able to recreate this lifeboat by putting in fictional children. And how did you make that decision? Like, how did you populate the boat with these fictional children? Did you pattern them after the ones who were really on the boat? Or did you decide, no, I'm going to populate the boat with children whose personalities I can use to tell the story? Because like you said, it is 8 days of monotony. And so how did you choose to put in the boat?
Yeah, again, another great question. I very consciously didn't want to use anybody who'd really lived through this. So I felt slightly uncomfortable with that, because it is a really raw, very lived emotional experience. And I think it gives you a little more freedom to create story. And what I really wanted the children to have sort of earned their right to be in this story. Children are often given a little sideline or don't have a voice. And I wanted the children in the boat to have their own little narrative arc, to obviously link the pieces between Lily and Alice. But they all have very distinct characters. And I did read a lot of the accounts of the children who were on the torpedoed ship and those who were in the lifeboat. They came from all parts of Britain, some from the north, quite industrial, some from London. Some had siblings, some were alone. Some were being evacuated privately by their wealthy parents. So there's a totally different scenario. And so I wanted to create that little cast of characters who each have their own role, and they all have their own story, and they have all completely stayed in my heart, broken my heart. I think they all sort of, are still in there somewhere. But I loved creating those children, and I hope that they do hold their own story within the book, because I felt this is such a children's story, but obviously this isn't a book for children. So there's a little challenge there, isn't there?
Yeah.
But I'm desperately fond of them all. Yeah.
No, you nailed it with those children. I feel like each one of them, like you say, had a little mini character arc and helped to keep humanity on the boat, which was important. So terrific. All right. So Julie, do we have any questions from our?
We have tons of comments. I want both of you to go back to this Facebook thread because there's so much love for both of you. And the comments are fantastic that are happening in the comment section. Lots of great readers are watching us right now. To the earlier point about where everybody's watching, we have people from all over watching us, watching this right now. I mean, Canada, all over the United States, everywhere. It's really fun.
Love it.
One of the things, Hazel, that I think was that really struck me, the lifeboat question was fantastic, by the way.
Amazing. And I've never been asked that.
That was
the first person to ask about the lifeboat, Susan. So thank you. That was brilliant.
Such a great question. And that was amazing. But one of the things that you mentioned, Hazel, too, and it's kind of the theme through the thing, that somehow we think that these women were stronger or more prepared to make these really horrific choices. And, I think of my grandmother, and I think that she was just like this strong, but they were just making it up as they go too. But somehow we put this thing that,
Yeah. And I think it's that, the blitz spirit of war, that keep calm and carry on. And I think there's almost this rose tinted view of, everything was quite jolly, actually. Well, it really wasn't. And I think some of that is because we attribute these additional strengths, additional coping mechanisms to people who just did cope, who just did find a way. I suppose, again, with the parallel with the pandemic, like we all did, we all found a way to cope, manage. We don't know how we did that. We just did. And I think we do sort of attribute some extra skill set to people who've gone through these experiences. And I'd actually love to know Susan's thoughts on that as well, because I know you've written, women and characters in really difficult circumstances. So do you agree with that? Do you think we do tend to put extra, beliefs on people who've been in that situation in the past?
Yeah, I do. And I think that sometimes we don't know how strong we are until we're put to the test. And so a character might start out thinking, well, I'm not a strong person. They may even read on the page as not a strong person, but then they're put into the crucible. And out of that, strength arises they didn't know they had. And I think that gives every reader confidence that if I'm ever in a situation like that, I will be able to count on that inner strength too. I haven't needed it yet, but it's there and it's waiting for that day where like the lifeboat, you hope you don't need it. But if you do, you'll find that you can do it.
Yeah.
Hazel, there's a question. Was there anything in the research, because you had obviously done extensive research on this, that you had to leave out or that you wish you could have put in, or was there anything that didn't make it into the book that you was it one of those nuggets?
I think, well, I certainly, Susan might not do this, but I massively over-research all of my books. I think I could almost write another book with all the bits I left out. And I think that's just a natural instinct to become very familiar with this era or this event or these people. But then it's the skill of knowing what serves the story. And the rest is really dinner party chat, isn't it, Susan? Like,
well said. Yes.
I don't know if there's any particular big thing that I had to leave out. I think it was just how much detail. So, for example, the Blitz, that was a whole other level, and I really only touched lightly on the experience of being in an air raid shelter, and what that actually felt and looked like, because those were just little touchstones in the book. So there was an awful lot that I read about, you know, volunteers, air raid warnings, and volunteers on the ground, medics that didn't get in. A lot more technical stuff about lifeboats and boats. I've become a sort of nautical expert. So some of that had to go.
Well, Sharon's asking as kind of a follow-up, are there any ideas in your research that didn't make it in the book that would be something for a future book?
Ooh, that would be telling.
Ah! I mean, honestly, because when we read your books or anybody's book, it's like you all as historical fiction writers send us down these rabbit holes, which I love, which we're Googling things and we're doing this other stuff, which I absolutely, that's why I love reading historical fiction. But for you all, that must be sort of the same way as you're going through. It's like, ooh, I might need to pluck that for something else over here.
Very true.
It's always nice to have a little sort of side hustle, and I don't ever delete anything. I just have cut scenes so that I may go back to them. Do you do that, Susan?
I do. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, because that is, the rabbit holes are some of my favorite things about reading. It's like, did that really happen? And then you look, it's like, oh my God, it did. Because you never know when you're reading fiction,
right?
What's real, you know?
And I think it really lends, I find, certainly if I read a book and I then learn that it actually happened or parts of the story, it really just adds a whole other layer of joy for me. And it's like, gosh, that, you know, fact is stranger than fiction, isn't it always? So to finish a book and then that actually happened, you know, it's remarkable, and it's just amazing to find these stories, and actually very humbling to find these stories and to try and bring color and texture and thought and emotion to those very static bits of history that are otherwise forgotten, lost, overtaken by more familiar, more, I don't know, intriguing or interesting narratives of events. So I really love, and I feel very humbled really to get hold of a story like this and to tell it in my words.
Or to your point earlier, the propaganda. So it's not just that, you know, that's what we're all fed in the history books and things. And it's like, oh, there's so much more layers and fabric to what was really happening day to day on the ground. Susan, do you have one last question that you were dying to ask Hazel that you have there, or before we kind of wrap everything up here?
Well, one question I want to ask, and you can decline to answer, but is there anything you can tell us about what's on the horizon for you? You don't I've got another one if you're going, nope, we're not talking, we're not going there.
I can tease. We haven't officially announced, but I am in that book at the minute, but I'm incredibly excited about it. I can't wait to tell all, but the slight tease is it's still historical, hooray. We're going to the Midwest, 1930s Dust Bowl era, coming out of the Great Depression, but this is an origin story. And I pitched it to my editor as a story you know, but a woman you don't. And hopefully when I reveal what this is, everyone will go, aha.
I love that.
I already love it. So you've got us sold even on the tease. And then one last question before we wrap it up, because I really want to know what you're going to be reading or what you're already reading this summer. Like, what can we put on our to be read list?
And you, Susan, you need to answer that question too.
Absolutely.
Yes. Well, I will have to say, the Paris daughter, Kristen Harmel, I'm cheating here because I've already read it, but I just adore it. And Kristen writes such beautiful historical fiction, and I'm a huge fan of hers. So I have to mention hers, and an incredible book, very different, that I've recently read called Yellowface by Rebecca Kwan, who wrote Babel. Yellowface is a literary thriller, and it's a real warts and all deep dive into the publishing and writing industry. So if any writers watching, oh my goodness, it's a roller coaster ride. And then on the other side, the new Emily Henry Happy Place is definitely coming with me on holiday. I love Emily's books. They're just so fabulously romantic and summer. So those are packed in my case, if you like. Susan, what about you?
So last night I finished Kate Morton's newest, Homecoming, which she always transports you to another world and another time. And then I just finished, what was I going to tell you? Gosh, it just left my mind.
I know, isn't it amazing?
I'll tell you what I'm going to read, because I honestly can't remember what the other one I had just finished and was going to tell you about. But I have on my nightstand next is Hello Beautiful by Anne Napolitano.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
which is like getting all kinds of rave reviews. I can't wait to dive in. And then I also just got an early copy of Christy Woodson Harvey's new book, Summer of Songbirds. So those two books are going to be my, I don't usually go down to the beach to read, but if I was going to go down to the beach to read, those would be my beach reads. I'll probably just stay in my backyard with the songbirds and
I love that.
Gorgeous.
Susan, before we let you go though, I want you to tell us quickly about your newest book, Only the Beautiful. It's actually my personal book club. I just picked that for our next read. So give us the little elevator pitch about Only the Beautiful.
Thank you so much. Well, this book is, like Hazel said, sometimes you're researching and you come across a little idea, a little nugget, and you save it for later. This book is that way. I was researching The Nature of Fragile Things, which is set in San Francisco before, during, and after the 1906 earthquake. And I came across a photo from the 1915 World's Fair, which San Francisco hosted only, 9 years after that horrific event. And it was of a booth called the eugenics booth. And I thought, what is that? And I knew when I was done with The Nature of Fragile Things, I was going to go back and do a deep dive into that movement. So Only the Beautiful is a book set against the backdrop of the eugenics movement, which we don't hear much about anymore. But it was a scheme to improve and control the human gene pool, the collective human gene pool, in not only in America, but in other places too. And what was happening in America did not approach the extent of what Hitler was doing in Nazi occupied Europe, but the ideology was the same. And it was to create a master race. And it happened here before he even built one concentration camp. So it's kind of a chilling look at our past. But again, as Hazel so eloquently said, tragedy, when it's dovetailed with hope, makes for a great story. So I feel like you guys will like this one, even though I deal with some difficult topics. There's hope. There's lots of hope in this book, because there are always good people out there.
But
it's
to both
a
of you,
beautiful book. It really is. And I think you handle such a difficult subject so well, and not every author could do that at all. And again, I was fascinated to hear that it was happening. And again, a piece of history we've just not heard about. So how incredible that you've brought that to light.
Thank you.
to your point, exactly, Hazel, it's these things that if it wasn't for you all digging them out, we would not know that these things were happening. So kudos to both of you for digging these nuggets out and enlightening all of us, because it's fascinating. Always a pleasure having both of you. I can't wait. Hope we get to do this again. Maybe one of you as an interviewee, who knows? But
Yeah, well,
Absolutely. I'm on for the next one.
yeah. Love having it. Hazel, congratulations on the release of the new book. Are you still in the middle of your tour? Are you still out there doing tons of things?
Yeah, so I had this crazy whirlwind in the UK for the last few days. I've had events in Ireland and then over to the UK. So I just got back yesterday. So I've a couple of days to catch my breath, and then more events coming next week. But it's just, it's so fabulous to be sort of in a full publication cycle again, and to be meeting readers and back in bookshops. So
right.
Yeah, it's all good.
All good. And Susan, can't wait I'm sorry that I missed your last event in San Diego, but I know you'll be back.
I will.
And so can't wait to see you in person again, but this is the next best thing.
Yes,
so everybody have a good rest of your Saturday, either morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're calling from. And we'll see y'all next time. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you.